In this video, I'll be showing you how I changed the crankshaft seals in my 1970 Kawasaki H1 500 triple. The first thing I had to do was to remove the engine from the bike, take off the barrels and pistons and strip the bottom end into all its parts. With the engine all stripped down, I decided to clean the crankcases first, so I take them out into the garden and give them a spray down with some of my bike cleaner, then hose them off with a hose. They were vapor blasted about 10 years ago, but they come up like brand new. With all the grease and grime removed, I headed over to my barbecue to dry them off. Five minutes later, they were all dry, so I lifted them carefully out of the barbecue and went back into the garage to start work on the crankshaft seals. The crankshaft looks in quite good condition. The bearings actually feel really nice, but the seals are very loose to rotate, and some of them had some damage on the outside, and the very end seal was really loose. It just pulled on and off, so it's about to go anyway. The big end bearings feel really smooth and have no play, so they'll be good to go again. So now I'm going to start stripping the crankshaft. So I grip it in the vise in some soft jaws to remove the top bearing, the little C-clip and the oil plate. The wire C-clip just prizes off with a screwdriver. Then I use my Sykes Pickavant bearing remover to pull off the bearings. They clip into the inner track and can remove a bearing without causing any damage whatsoever, so it can be used again if it's good, but I'll be replacing all of these with new SKF bearings with C3 clearance. The 4 oil plate screws are usually very tight, but come undone easily with a JIS screwdriver. The crankshaft had previously been scratched with a line across all 6 webs. This is to aid alignment on the assembly, so I could reuse this. Where the ruler's placed across all 6, they all lined up perfectly. So the next job was to press off the M web using an old gudgeon pin on my press. These old crankshafts can sometimes be really hard stuck together and need a fair bit of force to separate. Sometimes 5 or 6 tons is not uncommon, but the flywheel web came off, and I could get off the first connecting rod and big end, and that felt really nice. So now I can remove the inner flywheel for that end cylinder. With all the flywheels apart, I can now look at the seals, have a quick look at them, and they're quite bad. I'm glad I did decide to strip the crankshaft. These wouldn't have lasted much longer. This one's actually split. This M1's really loose, it's got no elasticity left at all, and the bearings had slight rust damage on them, probably from storage, but felt smooth. But they're all going to be replaced, so they'll just go in the bin. With all the parts cleaned up ready for reassembly, I lay out the bearings and seals on the bench. These bearings are SKF with C3 radial clearance for high-speed running, and the seals are OEM spec from Japan and very good quality. The first thing I'm going to do is replace the end bearing and seal assembly. So I grip the flywheel in the vise in the soft jaws, and pick up the bearing, place it over the axle and tap it on with a round drift and a hammer. It goes down easily with a few taps. With the bearing in place, I put on the seal collar and poke in the O-ring, pushing it down with a screwdriver. I use special rubber grease to put on these new seals just for their first bit of running to give them the best shot in life. With a nice smear on that seal, I then slide it over onto the crankshaft, and then I have to replace the sprocket and do up the nut tight. With the nut tight, the next thing I do is tap over the tab washer with my punch and a hammer. I then remove the part-assembled crankshaft, turn it over and re-grip it in the vise using my aluminium soft jaws to replace the inner bearings and seals. The last bearing has a snap ring groove and must be put on the crankshaft with the groove facing towards the centre of the engine. That's better, those seals feel much tighter than the last ones. So now I'm going to use my ruler and a magnet to line up the marks to replace the next flywheel web. It's just done by eye, so you line it up, and then on this side as well, and when you're happy, give it a light tap with a hammer just to secure it so I can lift it into the press to press the flywheel web on. Then using a suitable pressing punch, probably a crank pin out of a CRF 450, I press the crankshaft back together. Once it's pressed together, this little dowel goes in a hole that's got half cut in the shaft and half cut in the web. It's tapped in with a punch, and it goes straight in, nice and smooth. I then replace the next connection rod and big end bearing. I always make sure the Made in Japan lines up on the same side, just because I like to. There's no real reason, but it looks good. I use a bit of ZX1 extra lube to lubricate the big end bearing to give it its first bit of lubrication when the engine first starts, and then I replace the next flywheel web, just by eye. I use a small set square to help line up the two edges of the flywheels. This reduces the amount of tapping I have to do with a copper hammer in the end to true it up. With the flywheel web pressed on, I remove it from my press to start truing it with my copper hammer, but I had an accident and I hit my thumb and I had to go to A&E. It was really bad. I needed stitches, but anyway, I don't think I'll be doing that again for a little while. So I had to go and do some lighter work when I returned. So I went out into the garden to do a bit of rubbing down of the side covers. It was a nice day to be out in the garden rubbing down some side panels, but my thumb was throbbing really bad and I really wish I hadn't hit it with a 2 kilogram copper hammer. But hey, sometimes these things happen, you just have to persevere. So I went into the garage to look for some spray and I couldn't find any silver the right colour, so I had to ring my friend Neil. Hello, is that Neil? Great. Now, do you remember the code for the silver paint for the Kawasaki engines, like my H1? I'm going to paint them in the garden. What, you were doing for me? In your booth? What, you can do them straight away if I bring them over? Okay, that'd be absolutely brilliant. I'll whiz over straight away on my Super 6. It's a lovely day. See you in about 10 minutes. Bye. With the engine cases at Neil's for painting, I thought I'd go back in the garage and have a go at the crankshaft. I thought if I'm really careful, I won't hit my thumb again, will I? No, I won't. I'm definitely not going to hit it again. So I was very, very careful. I used my foot instead of my hand to hold the crankshaft. With the crankshaft tapped true with a copper hammer, I double check it with my steel rule by resting it onto the crankcases and pressing down and rubbing the shaft and then rotating the crankshaft, and I can feel the very slightest of movement. I'm quite happy it's true, so I replace the 2 bearings and seals and press on the next flywheel web. With the end webs pressed on, I check the crankshaft in the crankcase using my rule method, and I can see I've got a bit of run out. So I mark the high spot, go on the ground, which is this cushioned flooring, hit it once with a hammer at the high spot to tap it true, put it back in the crankcase, check again, and it's perfect. I'm well pleased with that, but I will just check it with a DTI just to make sure. I centralise my DTI, rotate the crankshaft, and I'm really pleased. It's less than 1/1000 of an inch, which is well within the standard specification. With the crankshaft assembled, it's ready to put back into the engine. On the Kawasaki Triple, you have to assemble it into the top crankcase. So I place that on the bench, upside down, so I can actually lower the crankshaft in onto the snap ring groove locating C-ring and make sure it's central and press it down. And I just check it rotates, and it's fine. The next thing to do is to put the gearbox in onto the selectors and check they all rotate freely. And it's really important that you line up the pegs, otherwise it can cause damage when you do the crankcases up. With the output shaft in place, I next put in the lay shaft, making sure that I engage the C-clip and the peg and it rotates freely, which it does. So now I can put some gasket sealer on the bottom crankcase. I use a little paintbrush because it puts on just the right amount, not too much and not too little. You You see so many engines put together with too much gasket sealer, and what happens, it all squeezes into the areas and jams up oil holes and gets in the way. So a nice thin smear is all you need. I placed in the kickstart shaft assembly and then lowered the bottom crankcase on carefully, pressing it down gently to engage with the studs and the dowels. Then put all the washers onto the studs, followed by the nuts. I went round and tightened all the nuts by hand at first, and then used my ratchet to tighten them down tight. With the crankcase bolts done up tight, I turned over the engine and put the gear shaft in and connected up all the selector mechanism, then started to assemble the clutch. I put the transmission into fifth and hold the output shaft with a socket, and then use another wrench on the nut on the clutch to tighten it tight, and yet rotates freely. I'm well pleased with that. So now I can assemble the clutch plates and the little spring washers that go between them. The little spring washers help the clutch disengage when you pull it in at the handlebar. It helps break the stiction between the clutch plates. With all the clutch assembled, I just check it rotates, and it's nice and smooth and rotates freely, so that's great. So now that's the bottom end assembled as far as I want to go at this point, so I'm going to take it out into the garden and fit it back into the frame. I lift the engine up onto a bucket so it's about the same height as the bike. That way I can lean over the tank and lift it across the frame without doing any damage. And it drops straight in. Brilliant. So now I can put the bolts in. They slide right through from one side to the other. I'll give the engine a bit of a wiggle to get the bolts to line up and then push them through. With the engine bolted in place, I can replace the rotor and stator assembly, securing it in place with the 3 screws. I then connect up the clutch cable and bend over the little tang to hold the nipple in place, followed by the gear lever and linkage, and I check the operation of the gears at this point, and all work. I'm going to be reusing the copper cylinder head gaskets, so first I heat them up with my blowtorch to anneal them, heat them cherry red and drop them in water. You can actually just let them cool down in air, but I like to drop them in water because I can pick them up straight away. With the 3 head gaskets annealed, I fit the new paper base gaskets, making sure that the hole is at the back for the oil injection. I then lubricate the little end eyes with a bit of ZX1, ready to install the pistons. The pistons go in with the arrow pointing forwards, pushing in the gudgeon pin, engaging with the needle roller bearings, and then fit in the circlip. And lastly, dropping down the barrel, and it fits perfect. With the 3 barrels fitted, the next thing I do is fit the cylinder head and the annealed copper gaskets. The H1 Kawasaki has long bolts that go down onto studs, and these are put in and then tightened with my ratchet. Each cylinder head is separate, so it's treated like 3 single cylinder engines. With the head bolts tightened, the next thing I do is to slide through the oil pump feed pipes and connect them up to the banjo points. Doing up the 3 bolts with my 14mm spanner. I then replace the 3 carburetors and connect up the choke cables and throttle cables, putting them back into their original positions. I can't go any further with the engine assembly until I get the bits back from Neil from painting, so I decide to refit the exhausts. When I fit the exhausts, I fit them to the bike and do up all the bolts by hand first, and then go around and retighten afterwards, otherwise they sometimes don't line up. And here we are, all 3 exhausts fitted, and she's starting to look back like a bike again. Hello?
Alan, your bits are done. Come and get them.
Oh, great. I'll be straight over.
Oh, you're here then. Yeah, that's a good cost, yeah.
Oh, they're wicked. That's absolutely amazing. Great. With the covers freshly painted and back at home, I can now put them on the bike, being very careful not to scratch them. So the first thing I do is fit the new gasket over the stator, lining up the 3 holes, then gently put the cover on and do up the 3 screws. With the front cover fitted, the next thing to fit is the sprocket cover. This has to sort of wiggle into place and mind the gear lever and a few other bits and pieces, and you have to line up this wire and the grommet and miss the carburetors, but you get there in the end, and then put in the 3 screws and tighten them, and it looks amazing. With the left side completely finished now, I went round to the other side and put on the clutch cover and the oil pump, and then I had to put in some oil because it's getting very close to a startup to see if it'll run. There's something quite satisfying about pouring new oil into a new freshly built engine. It just pours in lovely and no dribbles. I rechecked the level with a dipstick and it's perfect, so that can be screwed straight in now. With the oil in the gearbox, it's time to see if it'll start. So I turn on the petrol, turn on the ignition, press the choke and give it a kick. And I'm really pleased. It fired up on the 3rd kick. With the engine running great, it's time to take it for a test ride. So I pop in and put on my leather jacket and helmet. I'm just back from my road test, and the Kawasaki H1 is going great. It pulls strong through the gears, so with its new crankshaft seals and bearings, it should be great for a few more years now. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed my video, and don't forget to subscribe.